أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي رب زدني علما رب زدني علما رب زدني علما. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my dear sisters. I welcome you all. Jazakallahu khair for joining us. Without any delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, Sister Sara Salman. Sara lives in Cupertino, California. She is part of the Santa Clara chapter of ICNA Sisters. She was also part of YM Sisters National Shura for 2 terms. Currently, she's serving as Secretary General and Outreach Department in Church. She has a master's in counseling and currently working as an associate marriage and family therapist and also as an associate professional clinical counselor. Please do share your questions in the chat box, and inshallah, a few of them will be answered by Sister Sara. So without further delay, Sister Sara, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just a quick clarification in the intro. I was part of YM Sisters National Shura, but I'm not currently Secretary General or Outreach. Those were previous positions that I held. But inshallah, jazakallah khair. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. All right. So, as you can see, the topic for today is the Muslim identity role of families. I'm going to go ahead and quickly share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So, this is, we've heard there's been a lot of talks on identity crisis and the Muslim identity and what is all of that, right? There's been a lot of talks around that. It's a big issue right now. It's, being called an identity crisis within our Muslim community. What I wanted to do today was a little bit different. I want to really address the role of families as parents. Usually when we hear this topic, it's geared towards the youth and to help them kind of navigate what it means to form an identity and all of that. But I really wanted to, as this is an ICNA Sisters program, I really wanted to cater it to parents, your role as a family, as a parent, as a mother, and what can you do as part of this process, and what can you do to help your child or to help a community member? It doesn't have to be your own child, but just what can you do to make this process easier, or what impact can you have on this? And so I have 2 main goals for my program today. One is to go over what really goes into identity formation, what is a normal kind of a healthy identity formation process when youth are starting to explore and figure out what is their identity, what's normal. And then the identity crisis. When does it become a problem? When does it become a crisis? What are the causes? What are some of the problems? What goes wrong? What gets in the way? And what makes it ultimately really hard, and what our youth are struggling with today. And then the other goal for me today, inshallah, is to be able to cover, like I said, the role of the family. Throughout this process, when kids are going from young childhood to adolescence to young adults, and they're transitioning out into the world and they're figuring out their identities, what role is the family playing in this process? What are the negative impacts that are coming from the family? What are things that are just, they're not happening right? And then what can you do to fix it? What can we do as families, as parents, to have a positive impact, to have a positive role in that process, and to make sure that ultimately we have a Muslim identity as a family, that we're a Muslim family, and we're able to keep that really important part that's really important to all of us alive in our families and our youth moving forward. So inshallah, that's my goal, my hope for this program today. Like I said, if you have questions in the beginning, I'm going to try to leave some time at the end for Q&A, but if you have questions, just, you can type them in the chat and I'll try to get to them at the end, inshallah, okay? All right. Okay, so in the beginning, the identity formation, it's a very normal process that every child goes through, right? By the time they hit mid-adolescence, we're talking like teenage years, it's actually a developmental process that every teen goes through into young adulthood, where they're figuring out, they're exploring their identity. one part of this identity is the family, right? The Muslim household, what they're getting from their family, and then everything else, what they're getting from school and everywhere else. And so there's these two huge components basically into what the ideas that they're getting in order to form their identity. So what are the causes, like I said, that are making this difficult? What is getting in the way for young adults to even have a clear sense of self, for them to have like a clear idea of who they are, what their identity is? What is getting in the way, right? And so I'm going to try to give an example, an analogy, and bear with me, it'll make sense at the end. But I want you to imagine a child that's growing up with two parents, divorced parents. Imagine this child spends half their time with one parent and the other half of their time with the other parent, and they're living in completely different households. And imagine that one home, one parent's household has very strict rules, expectations. You know, there's routines, there's specific times to eat, there is a bedtime, there's a curfew, there are rules around what they can eat, there's rules around what they can wear. Imagine that this is, you know, a very boundaried, very strict kind of house with a lot of limits, and ways of being, right? And then the other household, imagine the other parent is very open, right? There's no limits, there's no structure, there's no routine. They can sleep whenever they want, they can wake up whenever they want. They're encouraged to try different things, try new things. They are they can go out whenever they want, they can come home, they can be friends with whoever they want. It's a very open environment. Now imagine this child growing up, going back and forth between these two houses. Half the time, 1 week they're spending at one parent's house, and then they go to the other parent's house. They spend a week there. And each time they're going back and forth, they're just living in this house, being exposed to the environment, and they just keep going like that for years. Since, let's say, this happened when they were a really young child, and as they're getting older into teens, they're going back and forth, and these two completely opposite households. What can you imagine would happen as this teen enters, you know, into their late adolescence, 17, 18, when they're about to graduate, maybe go off to college? What would you imagine would happen to this child? They would be very conflicted, right? When it's time, as teens get older into late teens, around 16, 17, 18, they start having more autonomy. They are encouraged to make their own choices. Even parents know this, right? Like, as the older your teens get, the more choices you let them make on their own, when you want to eat, and, you know, how you eat and the way you dress. Usually by that point, it's in their hands, right? So now when it's time for them to be making their own choices, when it's time to be figuring out, what is my life going to look like? They've got these two examples in front of them that they've been exposed to that are completely opposite, in complete conflict with each other. And so then they're really confused. And neither household gave them this kind of environment where they can go and talk about their confusion. They could talk about what it's like to be at the other person's house. Neither household was able to provide them with that kind of environment where they were able to come and talk about their feelings openly and really say, oh, this is how it's like when I'm over there. When I come home, it's like this. And, you know, back and forth. They weren't able to kind of talk through that. And so when it's time to decide and try to figure out for themselves what they want, they're just conflicted. They're confused, and then they don't have anywhere to go to ask, right, to help. Like, what am I supposed to do here? And so they start picking and choosing. Maybe they'll try some things from one household, they'll, you know, try some things from the other household, but they're not able to pick either one correctly, right? Because they can't do either one fully, because they're trying to meet in the middle. They're trying to please both parents. Let's say, like, one parent is one household, the other one's in the other, and they're trying to please both. And so they'll pick and choose a little bit. But what will happen eventually is both parents, both households essentially, will start criticizing. You're not doing this the way I taught you how to do this. I taught you to be open, and I taught you to be independent, and yet you're doing this way. Why? The other household will be like, I taught you to be like this, and this, and you're not doing this. You're not meeting these expectations. I taught you better. And so then they're being criticized for both. And so then they just feel like, well, I can't do either one right. Neither one told me how to do this. And there's so many choices. I have to figure out who I am in all of this. And so they're really, really torn. They don't have anywhere to go. And so then they start looking outward. They start looking at what their peers are doing. What are my friends doing? What are other people in my age group doing? Because they're going to get it. Maybe my parents just don't get it. These do different things that I'm exposed to. Maybe this is all just, ideas or whatever, but let me see what my friends are doing. And so then they turn to, their peers and they start doing what's easier. What's everybody else doing? What's the most common thing? And so now I want you to step out of that analogy and kind of imagine the Muslim household, right? Your home as being the one with the strict household. And I'm not saying that being a Muslim household means to be strict. It was an analogy to kind of explain that, in a Muslim household, we do have expectations on how we should dress. We have expectations on, the things that we do. We read Quran, we have rules, we have, to kids, a lot of what Islam is can appear as rules in the beginning because they don't understand spirituality. They don't understand the bigger picture. To them, it's just things that we have to do. So it comes across as rules and expectations. And then every Muslim household, has their own family rules and ways of being. But imagine that your household is that one home, that strict home. And then that second household that I was explaining, imagine that as being everything else: school, work, teachers, media, politics, everything else. That's their second household. That's their other parent. So when kids are going out into the world, right, you have the family is that one parent that's trying to teach them all of these positive things, having boundaries and having rules and being a good Muslim and all of that. But then on the other hand, they're spending half their life, 8 hours of their day, if not more, outside with all of the other things. And if we add in things like TV time and, books and movies and all of that, you can add to that 8 hours. At school, they're being thrown theories that, are being taught as facts, like the Big Bang theory or something, evolution theory. All of those are theories, but they're being taught as facts. So they're being given these that are in complete conflict sometimes with our Islamic values and Islamic beliefs. They're being given different ideas of how to be. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to have happiness? What does it mean to be independent? All of these different ideas, these questions. And so they're looking around like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I never thought about that before. Oh, I wonder how that fits into my life. And they're being tossed all of these things and they're considering them and they're considering, how does this fit into who I am? How does this fit into what my parents have taught me? And then outside of school, you have all of society. There's pressures to fit in to a label. There's a label for everything nowadays, right? There's a label for personality. Am I an extrovert? Am I an introvert? Am I outgoing? Am I shy? Right? There's a pressure to find a label for hobbies and interests. Am I athletic? Am I an artist? Am I, whatever. There's a million different things. There's labels for religion. Am I strict? Am I practicing? Am I Sunni Muslim? Am I conservative? Am I progressive? Right? Same with politics. Am I conservative? Am I progressive? Am I Democrat? Am I, all of these things. There's a label for everything. And so, adolescents, youth, they're trying to figure out all of these labels. So they've got their school, their theories, questions, all of that. They've got all these labels that they're trying to figure out. They're living in an environment where even being religious is being viewed as something backwards or very conservative. Like, how can you be, how can you have religion when religion looks at these things in such a negative way, right? So even being religious is seen as a negative thing right now. And then, of course, there's, especially if they're older and they're maybe in college, first 2 years of college or something, right? And there's, in academic settings, there's this huge controversy between religion and science. How can you have religion and be a person of science at the same time? How does that match up? And so they're trying to figure out, these are just some of the things, but they've got all of these things that they're trying to figure out. And at one hand, they've got their Muslim household, their family, and on the other, they've got all of this. I don't know about all of you, but just me saying all of this, I'm noticing like tension in my shoulders. I'm noticing like a feeling of overwhelm. I want you all to just check in with how does that, I just say all of this, what does that make you feel? What do you feel in your bodies? Because for me, that makes me feel really overwhelmed. That gets me super tired and exhausted just saying that. Imagine living in it day in and day out, right? These kids are going into school every single day with this stuff. They're going to work. They're having to answer questions about this type of stuff. Where do you stand? What's your label? What's your take on this, right? That's exhausting. That's going to get you feeling really, defeated, really just overwhelmed, maybe hopeless, scared, anxious. That's a lot to be carrying. That's a lot to be able to figure out. And then they come home, right? And there's a completely different set of expectations. There's different labels, different values when they come home. The only labels that matter at home maybe are you a good Muslim? Are you, and maybe if they're a cultural family, right? If you're from Pakistan or something, sometimes these, where we come from, even in Pakistan, becomes important. You know, are you Punjabi? Are you Bihari? Are you this? Are you that? There's so many other labels then at home. There's a completely different way of being at home. You have to dress differently, you have to talk differently. Your parents value other things. Are you a pre-engineering? Are you pre-doctor? Are you, there's a completely different set of values at home. And we're expecting our kids to figure all of this out without any kind of nurturance, without any kind of emotional support. That's a lot, right? And so this, in essence, is where the identity crisis is coming. This is the identity crisis right here, because they've got all of this and they don't know how that fits in, and they don't know how to show all of this stuff at one time. And so, right, this is in essence the dilemma. This is the crisis. The youth feels stuck. They get so stuck, they're unable to move in either direction. And they're also, like I said, not able to please either side. When they start incorporating some of what their parents are saying, okay, maybe I can take this seems okay, I can fit this in with my school things. If I dress the way my parents are saying, maybe I can still make my friends happy at school. I won't get picked on, maybe. Okay, from school, I need to watch this show because everybody's watching it, and maybe my parents won't mind. So they start picking and choosing a little bit, trying to kind of please both sides, but they're not able to. They still get criticized from both sides. They don't do something their friends want. Their friends are like, oh, come on, how can you not do that? How can you, not be this way? Come on, we're all doing this. They get all this peer pressure at school. And then at home, the parents are like, nope, that's not what we taught you to do. Right? This is an everyday thing. They're getting criticized from both sides. They're not able to please both sides. And this is, in essence, what leads to depression. This is what leads to anxiety, suicidality. Basically, they withdraw. They withdraw from their families. They withdraw sometimes even from their social settings. If they're never accepted at school, if they don't have fully accepting friends, they withdraw from there too. Sometimes people have really, these kids sometimes have really strong friendships and they're accepting. And so they're able to have that, thankfully. But usually what happens is, because they're not able to please both sides, they end up, these are your depressed teens, your suicidal teens that you see, because they have got no support. They feel like they're really alone. And usually what happens is that parents aren't willing to compromise their ideas, right? The parents aren't willing to imagine that their kids can pick and choose this way and that it can be okay. And what happens is that a child's natural instinct is to want their parents to be happy with them, to seek their parents' approval. This is very natural for every child, to want their parents to be happy with them. And when they're not, when they get the impression that my parent is very disappointed in me, doesn't like me, is ashamed of me, this is a very common feeling. When they feel like their parents are disappointed in them, it becomes too much to handle. And so they turn away their parents. And these are the parents that will come and say, my kid doesn't talk to me anymore. He doesn't say anything. She doesn't say anything to me. I'm trying to talk to her and she just turns me away. So they've completely, because their parents' disappointment was too much to handle, they've actually completely shut that door and they've turned them away because they couldn't handle their disappointment anymore. And so then these are the teens that you will also see that are turning to, if not friends, peers, just what is everybody else doing? Let me see what everybody else is doing. And so then, this is where you'll see a lot of youth turning to atheism or secularism, because at least that way, part of them is being accepted. At least part of who they are, half of who they were, half of their life, they can go and explore those things and those things will be at least accepted. And for now, that seems good enough. At least half of who I am can be accepted. My parents are never going to accept this half because I'm never going to be the perfect Muslim in this way. But at least they'll accept this outside. My friends, peers can accept this part of me. They won't accept the Islamic part of me, and they still want that. That's still part of who they are. But because that's never going to go anywhere, they just turn to atheism or secularism because at least I can be accepted this way. So now we're at this dilemma, right? We're at this point where things are so bad. So what at this point, right? The question is, so what can we do? What can families do? What role can families play? Often, so naturally, right? What happens naturally, like I said, is that a child should be able to go to their parents, should be able to turn to their families for support, for help. When kids are struggling, it is very natural for them to go to their parents and families. In family therapy, the first question I ask in the very first session when I meet with families is what I ask the kid, right? The teen, what came in the way? What went wrong? What's getting in the way of you being able to turn to your parents for help? Because that is an assumption that we make going in. Every child should be able to turn to their families for help, and that's a very natural thing. Something goes wrong along the way for that to not happen. But that's not a given. We take that as like a given thing, and now, kids don't turn to their parents. That's actually not a given. If kids want to turn to their families, they actually try to turn to their parents somewhere along the way, but something went wrong. At some point, something went wrong, that there was a rupture there that told them, I can't go to my parents. And so we're going to look at this a little bit more, right? And if there's people in this, audience right now that don't have kids, don't think about kids, think about maybe a family member, an extended family member, think about a community member, think about just how can you make sure that we're not turning away kids? How can you be that role model? How can you help youth along the way? And it doesn't have to be your own direct kid for some of these things to apply. So a lot of times, often parents will come to me and they'll ask, how do I, help my kid? What can my kid do to fix this situation? They need help, right? They'll come in saying that my kid needs help or this young adult needs help or something. I will often turn the question around and I will ask the parents, what can you do? Right? Like that's more important. Especially if they're an older adult, older adolescent, they're already out of your house, maybe, right? You don't have much that you can do at that point. They're already on their own. So the question becomes not about what you can do for them, other than forcing them, which you can't do, right? It's more about how do you deal with it? How do you sit with that? How do you react? What kind of relationship do you have from that point, right? Or if it's still a young child, they'll ask, how can my kid start listening to me? And it usually turns around into what can you do to listen, right? Have you listened? For the person, I'm going to take a quick kind of side tangent and just say this real quick, is that for the other person, when people approach me and asking me, what can I do about this person in my family or my child or a relative or community member that's struggling with atheism or secularism or any of these things, really, you can't do anything. That is my honest and frank answer. You can't do, other than just being who you are and being, providing support here and there. The best thing that you could do, and never undervalue the importance of dua, right? remembering that only Allah guides who he guides. Only Allah can lift the veil from people's hearts, from people's eyes. That is Allah's hands. What you can do is more important for yourself. How can you stay with it? Right? That other person, that's not in your control. When people come to me in therapy, we're looking at what's in your control. What can you do? That other person's not in your control. So worry less about that other person, make dua for them, but really focusing on what can you do as a parent, as a person in your community. So let's start with a young adult. Let's say you have a young adult in your family. This is somebody who's a little bit older, like I said. Maybe they're already out of the house, right? When we first see, let's take a step back. Sorry. When we first see our kids exploring, when they're starting to explore these different identities before they really go out, right? When they first start exploring these different identities, different ways of being, maybe they're exploring atheism or whatever, right? All these different identities that exist out there. Often parents respond with anger, right? The first response is usually anger. How can you do this? What are you thinking? This is not the way I raised you, right? Really angered type responses. Let's go deeper with that anger. Is it really anger? I'm going to give you a really easy example. Let's take a 4 or 5-year-old, for example, a really small kid. Let's say they run out into the street. What would a parent's reaction be? Really angry. Initially, it's like, why did you do that? Don't ever run into the street. I told you not to do that. How can you do that? Don't you listen? We have rules, and go back inside, right? They act out of anger, but it's not really anger. It's fear. A parent in that moment, their young child just ran out into the street, and they probably imagined all of the things that could have gone wrong. A car could have hit them. They could have gotten hurt. They could have fallen. Anything could have happened, and they get so panicked. All this fear comes up that all they can do in that moment is the way fear and anger and panic. I mean, the way fear and panic comes out is anger. You don't know what to do with all of those feelings inside of you that are bubbling up. And so then you just yell, right? It comes out as anger. Why did you do that? I told you not to do that. And sometimes parents get so overwhelmed that once they grab that little child, maybe they'll pick them up, they'll bring them inside, and they'll tell them, because it hurts to even look at that child at that point. They're so overwhelmed. They'll send that child to the room. Go in your room. I don't even want to look at you right now. Right? Because it's too much to see. That fear and that panic is too much. It's still there. And so parents sometimes have a really hard time regulating their emotions. How to sit with that emotion, that fear, that panic that just came up. It's the same thing as this child gets older. Like I said, when they start experimenting other things, they start exploring other things. It's this fear of this uncertainty. What can happen? You fear it. A parent's very natural instinct is to want to protect their kids. Just like a child has an instinctual need to want to be supported and to be loved by their parents, parents have especially mothers, have a very instinctual need to protect their kids, to want the best for their kids. And so oftentimes when parents are reacting, it's not usually anger. There's something deeper. It just comes out as anger. It's usually fear. And like I said, we have to keep in mind that it's very normal. It's a very normal part of development for kids to explore, for teenagers to explore the different parts of their identity, to figure out who they are. This is part of youth development, part of their cognitive development, part of their social development. This is just a normal process of being an adult. You probably went through the exact same development. It might not have been as jarring because maybe you were back home and the culture was different, same, and everything was the same. So all you were really figuring out was, how am I going to be different maybe in these ways? How is my personality different from my mom? How am I going to be a different kind of wife than my mom was? And so maybe the way you explored who you were going to be and how you differentiated and how you became into your own adult wasn't as jarring as it is now, but you still went through this process. And so, for example, when your kids start exploring different hobbies or interests or different personality styles or ways of talking, that doesn't scare you as much because you know you went through that. Every parent knows that every child is different, is going to explore these different things. And so not everything is scary, right? And you're able to kind of deal with them figuring out some of these things, and you don't always react in fear. Why? Because it's familiar to you. The only time it becomes so scary is when they start exploring something that you're not familiar with. You never went through that. You maybe never went through a period in your life where you explored religion, had doubts about the faith, about Islam. You maybe never considered having explored your own sexuality. You maybe never have explored, these kinds of things that kids are exploring now. And because you never did it, because it's so unfamiliar to you, that uncertainty is what causes the fear and the anxiousness. And so for young adults, when adults are kind of leaving their household, figuring this out, you have a lot of fear of like, what's going to happen to them? You're scared for their physical well-being. You're scared for their emotional well-being. You're scared for their spiritual well-being. This uncertainty of like, if they explore this, is this going to lead them away from a path to Jannah? Is this going to lead them to Jahannam? You're scared. That is a really valid fear. Like, if they keep going down this path, does that mean Allah is going to turn them away? Like, that's a really big fear. And so we end up responding. We end up parenting from a place of fear. And what that does is creates more division. What that does, it actually creates a bigger gap between you and your child. And so the most important thing to remember, whether we're dealing with an older adolescent or a younger adolescent, is to be able to control that fear, to be able to regulate that fear and that response in that moment. Taking a deep breath when you see something like that, just close your eyes, take a deep breath, and understand, okay, I'm just reacting from fear right now. I'm getting scared. Let me calm down, right? Regulate yourself in that moment, and then listen. Just listen to especially if this is an older person, an older, like I said, adolescent. You want to listen. You want to ask a lot of questions. How can I support you? What can I do to help? I'm hearing that you're really confused. What can I do? Ask a lot of questions rather than making statements. And the biggest thing for people who've already kind of started exploring and already outside of your household, and we're not talking about younger teens here, is to never shut the door. Because the more you respond out of fear and ultimately anger, what's going to happen is you shut that door permanently, where these older adolescents are not going to want to come back to you. They're not going to want to talk anymore. They basically think that, okay, this is hopeless. And you've shut the door for them to ever be able to come back. And so never, ever shut the door. Keep that door open, keep your communication open, keep asking questions, and know that you can't force these things on them.
Get done to tell me more resist. I get it for character development, but I think in the time.
Sorry, I'm hearing somebody else. I don't know if somebody's unmuted. Okay, sure. And so you can't force anybody, right? You can't force anybody to be a certain way. By you trying to force them, it's actually going to push them further and further away. So you have patience and you get support, right? It's not easy to live in a place where your child is exploring these things and you're really scared. So you get support for yourself, whether that's through community members, through friends, through a therapist. I do this all the time. I sit with families, I sit with parents, and I help them to kind of sit with that uncertainty, that anxiety of what it is to see your child going through this. But ultimately, that's all you can do at certain points, especially if they're older, because you cannot force. All you can do is make dua, listen, and be that stable person, because most likely they're going through this period of exploration. They're going through this period of they're trying to figure out what life is going to look for them, what their identity is. But if you shut that door, then you've essentially closed off them ever coming back to that. You've done all you can throughout their life. You've instilled in them the Islamic values, the ways of being, right? They have all of that within them. Let them figure it out now. All you can do, the best thing you can do is be supportive, talking to them, asking them questions. If we're talking about an older person, let's say your kids are away at college or something, they come home on weekends, you pray as you normally would. as a family, you don't try to force them to pray with you if they're in that place where they're not wanting to pray anymore or something. But you pray as a Jama'ah, as a family, and you invite them to join. If they don't, that's okay. You're still going to pray. You still keep doing all the things that you're going to do. You maintain your Islamic identity as a family. And then you just invite them along. And if they don't, that's okay. You're going to keep doing that. You're going to be persistent in who you are without forcing it on them. If they're much older, let's say they're, you have older kids who have their own families or something, and they come to you occasionally, you can do something like, if you're taking a Quran class or if you're taking literature classes or something and you're learning something, at the dinner table, you bring up, oh, I learned something like this, and, I want to share it. And you validate their experience. I know you don't believe the same things I do, but I'm going to share this because it's really exciting for me to learn. And so you kind of frame it that way, and you put in little bits here and there. I'm not saying you completely turn away from who you are and you don't start, doing dawah in small ways, but the biggest form of dawah that you can do with your family is to be a well-regulated, controlled person, a supportive, strong person in your family, so that kids know that they can, no matter how old they get, that they can come to you, that you are safe. So that's for older kids. Let's come to a little bit younger. What can you do if you still have younger adolescents at home? Younger kids, younger teens. Number one, right, is be the safe person. What does that mean? At schools and stuff, right? In public high schools and even middle schools and things, they have what's called like a safe classroom or a safe zone, where basically kids can go and talk to this adult and feel really safe and not judged. You should be that person. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to be that person for your kids. That when they come to you, they know that you're not going to explode, that you're not going to react, that you will listen. You don't have to agree. Listening, sometimes parents think that just listening to their kids means that you're agreeing with them. It doesn't mean that you agree. It means that you're just listening. They come to you and they say, oh, I'm really like not understanding why in Islam we do this, this, and this. Why does it have to be this way? You respond by saying, okay, I'm hearing that this is not making sense to you. This is really confusing you. Okay, let's sit and talk about it. Did I just agree with that person? Did I just agree with my child? Yeah, none of it makes sense. Yeah, you're right. No. Did I judge them? Why, how can you think this is wrong? This is Islam. There's nothing wrong here. No. You validated. Okay, you're confused. Let's sit and talk about it. What's confusing you? Right? Being that safe person that's not reactive. That it feels emotionally safe. I'm not talking about physical safety, emotional safety, so that your child can feel emotionally safe around you. Number two, you can try to incorporate and link spirituality with meaningful family experiences. For example, after maybe there's one prayer that everybody prays together, right? Whether it's Maghrib or Isha or, so you link a form of spirituality. Everybody plays together. We pray in Jama'ah as a family. And afterwards, we play a board game together. We watch something together. So you link a really spiritual aspect, right? A really important part of the deen or something. Maybe it's a family halakha. After we do a family halakha, and then afterwards, we go out to eat for dinner. We order pizza. We talk and we laugh. Right. So by doing things like this, you create this safe environment where it's like kids feel comfortable. They feel like, okay, it's not just, we do these things that we have to do, and then things are completely separate. You create what it means to be a Muslim family. And so link two things together, family time and spirituality. Create traditions and family rituals together. Weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. Some kind of tradition where you do something and it's with your kids' input. You ask them, maybe 1 month, one kid decides what they want to do as a family. The next month, another kid decides what they want to do. And you give them kind of limits. Okay, this is how much money we can spend. This is how far we can go. But you do something on a either weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis that are traditions for your family. And during this time, there's no lecturing, there's no, you have to do this, this, and this. It's just a way to be together, for you to be able to talk to each other, to listen, create family bonding moments where there's no pressure and they can just be themselves. Most importantly, right, is being open, being curious, and learning. When all of you are, let's say, in a Quran class or something, or going to halakas, or you're trying to learn something new, right? How do you learn? You ask a lot of questions. You're in a like a Zoom room or in-person room or something. You're so energized. You ask so many questions. Oh, what about this? Oh, how can we do this? And what does this mean? And what does that mean? Treat your kids the same way. They didn't come with a manual, right? You don't know everything about how to be the perfect parent, right? This is not something that's instinctual. These kinds of issues are not something that you know how to do automatically. So think about it as you're learning something new. And so be curious, learn, ask a lot of questions. Oh, you're learning this about the school. Tell me what that means. What's that like? Oh, what do you do when you somebody asks you a question like this at school? How does this make you feel? Oh, what's that like when I tell you to do this? Be so curious, be so open, right? Just learn and talk to your kids. Just this week, I actually had a mom that I'm working with a whole family, and the mom, she comes to me and she says, in my individual session with her, she says, I don't know how to talk to my kids. She said, I never did that when I was growing up, and she's talking to me in Urdu and she's saying, मैं तो बस ऐसी चीजों की बात करती थी, right? Like I just used to talk about like food or if someone's coming over or something, but I didn't talk about things. Like I don't know how to talk to my kids. And so I told her, I was like, well, just start with asking a question. If they're doing something, just ask them, what do you like? What do you want to do? What's this like? And so this next week, I had the following session with her son, and her son comes in and he goes, my mom asked me about video games. And I was so shocked, I didn't even know what to say to her. But she made the effort, right? And I asked him how that made him feel. And he was like, so nice. She's never asked me anything before. I mean, you'd be amazed at how much just asking one question, being curious about something that your kids are interested in can make such a world of a difference. So just be as open and curious as you can. Ask a lot of questions. The next point is compromise. What can you do to make it easier for them, right? This is, like I said, go back to the beginning. There's so many things that they're trying to figure out. What can you do? Where can you compromise just a little bit? Think culture versus religion. A lot of times, the hardest thing for parents is to let go of their own culture. And the problem there, the reason I bring that up is because kids growing up here, their culture is the American culture, right? They have Islam, but then their culture is the American culture, whereas yours is Pakistani culture, Indian culture, back home, whatever your culture may be, right? But that's not their culture. That's their heritage, yes, that's their ethnicity, sure, but that's not necessarily their culture. And so when we start intertwining those two things, religion and culture together, that is really, really difficult. You're adding another thing that the kids have to explore, another thing that they have to figure out. So see where you can compromise on the culture. Is it necessary that your kids wear shalwar kameez? Because that's part of culture, that's not part of faith. So what really reflect on how do you incorporate culture into your family? How do you incorporate religion? And where are those two things separate? And what can you compromise? If the most important thing, and I hope it is, right, it's that they're Muslim. That's the most important part of their identity. Then focus on that. Be strict about that, but don't be strict on the Pakistani culture or the Indian culture or the Bangladeshi culture. That's less so important because that's not their direct culture. You can keep that culture, right? And they can see it through you, right? But you don't necessarily need to enforce that on your kids. That, for me, a lot of the times what I've seen in my experience is that most of the time it's not even about religion, it's mostly about cultural expectations that gets in the way of kids and parents. parents don't want their kids to marry somebody outside of their own like village or clan or something. That stuff is completely meaningless to kids here. It holds no meaning because they've never even lived in that environment. To you, it's really important. Yes, that is part of your culture. You came from that. It's really important. But for them, it doesn't even, I mean, they've probably barely even spent any time in those countries, let alone know what the different villages and the different cultures there mean. And so really think hard about what are you okay with letting go of in order to preserve the Muslim identity. Because our religion, our faith gives us allowance, gives us space to incorporate different cultures, right? So as long as it's not outside of the bounds of Islam, what parts of American culture is okay to incorporate? This is the last point on here, make amends. That's one of the hardest things for parents to do. To be able, if there is a rupture, if you've ever reacted out of anger to your parent, to your child, right? If you've ever reacted out of anger, it's impossible to think sometimes for parents to be able to go back and say sorry. Most of the time, parents and families want to just brush things under the rug. Like, okay, it happened. Let's move on. Let's move forward. Okay, I did that in the past, but now I'm going to be better. But that rupture has already occurred. That event where you reacted out of anger maybe, and you weren't able to control your emotions in that moment, that has already occurred. That's there. And so you've already kind of sent a message to your child saying that, so your child's going to be wondering, is she going to react like that in the future if I say something? If I go to her, how is she going to react? Is she going to get angry with me again? And so there's already this uncertainty. They already don't want to maybe come to you and talk to you. And so the way you get past that is not to just move forward, but to actually go back and say, listen, I'm really sorry I reacted that way. I got scared. I was really scared for you, and I reacted, and I'm sorry. I'm going to try to listen. Don't force them to talk to you, but just say, I want to be able to listen to you. I want to be able to support you. If you want to talk to me, I'm ready now. I'm ready to listen. But don't force them to say, now talk to me because I'm sorry, now talk to me, right? That kind of defeats the purpose of saying sorry. So you say sorry, you make amends, and then you leave it on them. Like, I'm ready to listen when you're ready. But making amends is the most important thing to repairing that rupture, to moving forward in a more healthy way. You have to go back and repair that. You have to express how you feel. Kids need to be able to hear that. And just end point, right, is what can you do to make this transition smoother? To make this identity formation that they're going through, this period where they're figuring out who they are, what can you do to make that smooth as possible, as easy as possible? Because they're figuring out so much. It's so difficult, right? So anything you can do to make it as easy as possible. Just talking to them, like I said, being open, trying to figure out where you can compromise, making it easier for them, creating meaningful experiences, family time, knowing that you guys, the Muslim household, the family, is their secure base, is where they should feel the most comfortable, the most free. How can you make that happen? Just thinking about that. Inshallah, I'll end there. And I know there's probably a lot of questions and things, so I want to leave some time for questions, inshallah. All right, I'm going to take a minute to go through the chat, but I don't know if people want to speak up and ask questions or if I should just go through the chat.
Jazakallah khair, Sara, for such an insightful talk on Muslim identity and role of families. I hope we all can benefit from the tips given and be the better role model for our kids and in our community, inshallah. So yeah, I'm going to ask the sisters if they can just write their questions in the chat box or unmute and ask questions with Sister Sara.
So there's a question in the chat. In this day and age, what do you think are the most important, potentially anti-Islamic concepts that parents should expose their kids to at home in a controlled environment and discuss before their kids start exploring? For example, the religion, sexuality, extravagance, etc. I think all of those, right? Because like I said, kids are already being exposed to this, especially now, younger and younger, starting from even elementary school, kindergarten, they're being tossed all of these ideas and ways of being, all of that. And so as early as possible in developmentally appropriate ways, exposing, not, I wouldn't even say exposing, it's just introducing. You be the one to introduce it, being the one to be able to talk about it. And part of those, like the thing that I was mentioning about creating traditions and rituals together, it could be that having weekly family meetings where you come together, and it doesn't just have to be, Quranic halakas or things like that, but it could just be topics like this, right? There are a lot of books out there that teach parents how to communicate about these taboo topics. And just because they're not Muslim, books or something, they're not Islamic books, doesn't mean that they don't have useful information. There's ways to talk to your kids about sexuality. There's ways to talk to your kids about, what it means to have a safe touch and for people to touch you appropriately. There's books out there about how to discuss anger and feelings and emotions and interfaith dialogues and just all sorts of things, right? And so you pick one of those topics every week and you bring it to your kids. You talk about it. You let them ask questions. And when you don't like a question that they ask, being able to sit with that, okay, you're asking this question. I'm not really sure where you're coming from. Tell me more. Can you tell me more about what you're trying to ask? And then being really honest when you don't know the answer. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to find out for you. I can tell this is important, so I'm going to find out for you. And then you go and ask somebody and you come back to them. But really trying to figure out what your kids are thinking about, because, they're already being exposed to everything at school. And so it's really important that you take charge in that. You're the parent. You should be leading that. I hope that answers your question.